Everybody ready to talk about WP Query?
Yeah.
Yay.
It's exciting stuff. You should be excited. I'm going to pause before I get into anything to point out, because I always forget to do this until the end of my talk, or like halfway through, and someone's like, "Can we get your slides?" My slides are already online. You can skip through this talk faster than me if you go to wpsessions.com/WCORL. All of the slides, all of the resources that I link throughout are all there and waiting for you. Plus a surprise that you otherwise wouldn't know about until the end, but now you'll know because you can go through the slides just as fast as your fingers will take you. Yep. We're going to talk about WP Query, which is sort of the backbone of WordPress. And all of you, if you've done anything with WordPress in any capacity, have definitely interacted with it in some way. How many people in this room would not identify as a developer? A few of you. Cool. All right. So you'll get some stuff out of this, but not as much as the rest of you who like to hack around and build things. At least you'll know how WordPress works and does things. So we've got a roadmap and stuff. So we've got quite a few different things to cover here. We'll talk about some of the basics of what's going on, look at some of the other ways that you can get data out of WordPress, some tips for modifying queries and making things faster, and how to not make mistakes. I'm very good at making them, so I've documented a bunch of the ones that I've made in hopes that you won't make the same ones. And if you're wondering a bit about who I am and why I can talk about this, I run wpsessions.com, where my claim to fame is paying people smarter than me to come and teach things. So there are about 84-ish hours of talks on there if you want to learn way more stuff after WordCamp is over. I built it because that's what I wanted, and now it exists, so you're welcome. So let's talk about some basics. WP Query, well, the loop looks like this. If you've opened any WordPress template file, apart from the header and footer and sidebar, this is probably what you've seen somewhere, right? If we have posts, while we have posts, set up the post, then do whatever it is that we need to do on that template, and then end while, end if, right? So that's the standard loop. That's how WordPress outputs whatever it is that you want to show on that page based on what someone is supposed to be looking at. What you might not realize is that these are all wrapper functions. That's their DJ name. This is their actual name. There's a global WP Query variable that is pre-populated for you when you're on the page. And when you're calling have posts and the post, what you're actually saying is, for the global WP Query object, if that has any posts, do something with them. And this is an important thing to note, and we'll come back to that in a little while. And so WP Query, when you're making your own, looks a lot like this. So you create a variable, and then you build up a new WP Query object, and you tell it what you're looking for. So this is sort of the basic query when you've just installed WordPress and you don't have anything else fancy going on. It loads the 10 most recent posts. So we've got post type. We're getting 10 of them, and specifically only the ones that are published, because we don't want to show any of our draft content or private content or anything like that. There's also a wrapper function that you can use called get posts, which is actually the equivalent of the get posts method from the WP Query class. It works exactly the same. You may not have noticed the nuanced difference here. I'll go back and forward. The syntax is exactly the same. There are a few differences. First of all, get posts returns the array of posts that you want directly. So you don't have to loop through it. You just have an array of post objects that you can work with and do whatever you want with. So if you're not trying to make a loop for a standard template output, maybe that's what you want. It also sets a few of the query parameter defaults for you. It suppresses all filters, which you might not want, so that's an important one to know about. It automatically ignores sticky posts, which is handy. If you've ever tried to say, I want just 4 posts to show in this widget here, and every once in a while you see 5 or 6, and you're wondering, like, where are these other 2 posts coming from? I said 4. It's because they are sticky posts, and what WordPress does is it gets whatever number you asked for, and then it goes and gets the sticky posts and put those at the front. And this will tell it to not do that. Give me just the 4 posts. I don't care if anything's sticky. And then it also sets no found rows to true, which is a handy performance thing, and we'll look at that in more detail later. But basically, it doesn't bother calculating anything else. It just gives you the posts, and then it's done. And there are tons of query parameters available to you. If you've never written any MySQL yourself, which is entirely possible. In fact, I started WP Sessions 4 years ago because I was struggling with some direct database queries, and I was frustrated. Like, how have I made it this far in my career, and I don't know anything with MySQL? It's because WP Query does all of the work, and you can just get whatever you want as long as you know all of the parameters to get it. And so we'll take a quick sprint through some of them. I've got a link here to the codex page that has all of them. And those are really only important to you when you want them. Right? Basically, if you can think of a way that you probably want to query some data out of WordPress, there's a good chance that there's an argument that you can pass WP Query to write the MySQL that you need to get just the data that you want. So for posts and pages, we can say, like, give me just this particular post for this ID or for this slug. Give me the parent for this, or rather, children that have this parent or this collection of parents. Or specifically that are not part of this collection of parents. Give me just these 5 posts, or give me everything except these 5 posts. Any post that's published or anything that's private. I want the post type, or I want the recipe post type, or the page post type. Or if you're talking about attachments, the MIME type, right? I just want these kinds of image attachment posts, or just these MP3 file posts. And then we've got ordering and pagination, right? We can set things to be ordered by post date, or post title, or post author. We can have them in ascending order or descending order. We can say, I don't want you to paginate these at all, or I do want you to paginate them and show me 10 posts per page, 12 posts per page, 2 posts per page, whatever. Skip the first 5, show me page 6. And there's ignore sticky posts again, which I included under pagination because it most often messes up my pagination, as I gave you the example before, where I want 3 posts, but it's giving me 5. And that's because 2 of them are sticky, and they come along for the ride no matter what, unless you say to ignore them. We can query things based on permissions. So only show me things if the user permission level is 5, which I think is author or editor. If it has a password, if the password is specifically sandwiches, only give me the posts that have a password set of sandwiches. If you want to search for things, there's tons of parameters for you. There's 1. You specify S equals and then whatever your search query is, and that's how WordPress searches for things. In fact, a quick hack that I use when I'm landing on a site that I know is WordPress and I want to find something quickly and they don't have a search box, or sometimes even if they do and I don't want to scroll down to wherever it is, I just append $S equals and then whatever it is that I'm looking for on their site, and I trigger the search results page for WordPress. If you want to query things by author, right? This is important when you're making author archives, but WordPress does that for you automatically. But sometimes you want to show, maybe in someone's bio box, they've also published these other 3 posts. You can query just 4 posts by that person. You can query for things by specific categories, or groups of categories, or anything except those groups of categories. Same with tags, same with any other taxonomy. There are also specifically taxonomy queries that we can run. We'll get to those in a minute. For date, you can query by year, month, day, hour, minute, second, or week of the year. Like, I only want posts that were published on the 30th week. I don't know why you would want that, but you can. You can get just that specific group, or a much more advanced date query. And then for post meta, right, any of the custom fields that you've registered for your posts. A good example for this is e-commerce, right? I want to find every product that is between $10 and $50. The price, presumably, is a piece of post meta, and you can query and find all of the posts that have a numerical value for price between that range. And that gets pretty advanced. And the meta query here is fantastic. This, I'd say, is new, but it's been around for like 3, maybe even 4 years now. 3.6, 3.7. It's been a while. But before this, it was really tedious. If you wanted to find everything that had this piece of meta and this or this piece of meta, or everything that had this piece of meta and this piece of meta, but not this piece of meta. 3.5, yeah, so like almost 5 years.
No, sorry, 3.2. Sorry.
Yeah, so this has been on for a while, but before they changed, that's right, they added some ability for comparing and setting those and or relationships. So you can search for multiple pieces of meta in an inventive way. Same with taxonomies. And then date query, to dig into this one deeper. So we already mentioned when you're just searching by date, you can add year, month, day, week, et cetera. But then you can specify an entire array of dates. And so you can say, I want everything after this date, but before this date, inclusive of those dates. Or not inclusive, right? I want everything from January 1st to December 31st, inclusive. Or everything from May 1st to May 20th, not inclusive. So that gives me May 2 through May 19, really. And you can even change what column it's using. So by default, it uses the published date. Maybe you want it to query based on the post updated date. Or maybe you want it to query the date based on a completely different field entirely, a custom meta field that you've registered that stores some kind of a date. Let's say you're doing events, right? You've got an event calendar plugin. You want to show all of the events that are happening in a particular range. The event date is a piece of meta. And so you can use a date query based on that meta field, thanks to how they wrote this, which is awesome. And so here's an example of a date query. So here I'm getting everything that's after January 1st, 2016, everything before February 28th, 2016. And I'm just showing that you can give it a totally humanized date string. So you could say January 1st, even with the ordinal 1ST. You could say last Thursday, everything from last Thursday to today. And thanks to PHP's ability to parse date strings, it can get that back out to a timestamp and then query for everything from a week ago to now. And then here I've got it set inclusive. So we will also include anything that was published on January 1 or on February 28. Very powerful ways to mine things based on their date. For taxonomy queries, we can set up the relationship for everything that's in this taxonomy and this one, or this one, or this one, or this one. And then we can have arrays of terms. So we could say for everything that's in the animals taxonomy, and then everything that's classified as a frog or a bird, but not a lizard. And you can say include all of the child terms. So if we've got trees, and then under tree we have maple, oak, whatever, we can include anything that's nested underneath, or just the things that are specifically tagged tree, but not things that are tagged maple. Which is handy so that if you, depending on how you classify posts, right, maybe you do say that this is a tree and specifically is a maple tree. Or maybe you only say that this is a maple tree, and that's good enough. And in that case, you do want to include children because maple tree is a kind of tree. And that saves someone who's responsible for the content from having to also basically double tag things, right? To tag it as a tree and a maple tree. That's somewhat redundant. And so a more complicated example here, I know that this is going to be smaller and harder to read, just demonstrating some of the power. So we can say, so the relationship between these two outer arrays is or. So we want a resource type that is an ebook or a list, or something that is of webinar and completed. So we want the completed webinars, it has to be both, or an ebook or a list. So we're, in this example site, they've got a whole bunch of resources, ebooks, white papers, webinars, et cetera. And on the main archive of that, they wanted to show everything that you can access right now, which would be the completed webinars that have happened sometime in the past, but not the ones that are in the future, because we're looking specifically at the immediate access content. And then they had a separate view for the future webinars. And this is how we did that. Meta queries can be simply equally complex, but gathered in a much more simple way thanks to how they changed the meta query operator. But same deal. So here we've got a relationship and. So this is a pricing example. So this is an e-commerce. So we want anything that's between $20 and $50 and is the color red or is sized small or medium. I don't know why you would have such a filter, but people can filter your e-commerce shop however they want, right? So maybe they want to find anything that's red, or they want to find things that are specifically in their size of small and medium. Right. And they only want to spend anywhere from $20 to $50. So There's a few examples. Let's talk about some of the things that you might not know. For instance, you might not know that WordPress has already queried all of the posts that it thinks it needs by the time it's gotten to the template that it's loading to show things. This is important because when you think, I'm going to query a different set of posts for this template, you think you're running two queries, right? You're running the query that WordPress ran to get you here, and you're saying, no, I don't actually want those. I want these other posts instead. So I'm going to run a second query. No big deal. You're actually running 8 queries, at least. You're probably running way more queries per page than this. And the reason for that is because every time WP query is run, it runs 4 separate queries. It runs the one that you expect to give you the content that you wanted. Then it's also counting up the total number of posts that are available, which is important for pagination, right? I need 10, but how many are there? OK, there are 100. That means I have 10 total pages, so I have 9 more pages that I can show after this. Then it's getting all of the metadata for every single post. And then it's getting all of the terms for every single post. You might think, like, wow, those extra queries are somewhat expensive. Until you realize all of the times that you use get post meta in a template to show like the color and the size and the price for something. If it didn't do this, those are all separate trips to the database, which means that if you have a product archive, and on that product archive, you're showing the title and the photo and the price and the size and the colors, that means you're running 5 queries times, say, 50 posts that you're showing. That's a lot. But because WordPress automatically gets every piece of metadata for every single post that it gets, it runs 1 query, and you can use get post meta 100 times and never have to touch the database again, which is really cool. Same thing for terms, because sometimes you want to output a list of terms. Sometimes you just want to show 1 term, and your opinion changes depending on what kind of content you're trying to show. And so WordPress just gets all of them for you ahead of time because it doesn't know what you want to show. But the good news is these can be disabled. So if all you want are just the posts you're asking for, you can tell it to not do any of those other things. So let's talk about timeline, because WP query isn't just a single event that happens. It's one of many events that happen as WordPress is loading up your site. And so the very first thing that happens is that a visitor requests a URL to your site. I want to look at whatever. And then core files get loaded, because we need to load WP config so we know how to talk to the database and a whole bunch of other things to actually make WordPress work at all. And then we load in the plugins, and WordPress fires the init hook, which is normally thought of as like the first hook that gets fired for you doing anything in your plugins or in your theme. You can hook into init, and you at least know that core files are loaded and stuff. There's actually like dozens of other hooks that fire before this that you might want to load, like template redirect or template loaded. But anyway, init gets called at this point, way down the line. And then the text domain is loaded. So if you have text that's being shown in another language, this is the point at which it gets translated. And then the themes functions.php gets loaded and figures out, like, OK, what sort of other things do I need to know about and do for this theme that we're with? And then the core WP function is run. How many people didn't know that there was a function in WordPress named WP? I didn't ahead of researching this. It's actually pretty cool. This is what sets up. There's also a class called WP. And that gives us a bunch of globals that we use. And it also calls WP main, which we'll get to in just a minute. And then, after all of this, the template is loaded according to whatever the template hierarchy is for the request. So maybe it loads index.php. Maybe it loads author-john.php. Right? WordPress works through the hierarchy and figures out, this is the template we need. And then the template runs the loop and iterates through all of the posts. So when you are in your template and you're going, I need a different set of posts than what WordPress is going to show me here, and you run a new WP query there, it's already done all of these other things, which means there are other opportunities for you to decide and tell WordPress, I don't want the posts that you think I want. I actually want these ones instead. Which gives us a lot of opportunity to make things more efficient and bring other data along for the ride if we need it, so that we're not doing all of these extra queries after the fact. And other things happen after this as well. So to dig into WP main for a second, I know there's a lot of text on here. I'm not expecting you to pay very close attention to this. I just want to point out a few things that WP main is what parses the request that someone puts into the URL to figure out what are we looking for? What kind of, are we on a post archive? Are we on a custom post type archive, a meta archive? Are we looking at a specific page, an author archive? What are we looking at? It reads the URL and figures out what the intent is of that visit. Then it sends the HTTP headers so that the browser knows what we're looking at. Then it runs the query. And at this point, oh look, a laser pointer. We set up all of the query vars that we need for things like is archive, is author, so that you can figure out conditionally what to show in your template. And then it calls get posts, so it converts all of the query args that were set into MySQL to send them to the database to get our data back. And then if there's anything wrong, it handles the 404 errors and then registers up all of the globals that we need that it figures out up in this stage so that we can use them in our template to render all of the different content that we're showing off. So there's a whole lot going on here. You can read the query overview entry on the codex and dig into each of these deeper because there's a lot of really cool things packed into this. I pulled out a few that I'm going to share with you in these next few slides. So to modify our queries, the WP query class gives us a ton of different hooks, both action hooks and filter hooks. And as I mentioned, we've got init where we can tap into things and then things even before init as well. So one place you might choose to modify your query to change what data you're getting is the request hook, which is the filter hook, which means that you can modify what the request is. So at this point, WordPress has already figured out, like, this is what the user is requesting, so this is what I think we need to get. And you can say, no, don't return that. Instead, I want you to return this other stuff. One important note here is that you have no conditionals available to you because no query has been run. So we can't know if this is archive or is author or is page or is singular of a particular post type. You sort of have to infer that yourself based on what's in the URL. And this only works for the main query that WordPress is running. So if you try to filter this, it won't filter every other query that's on the page in the sidebar, in the footer, in the header. It only adjusts the main query in the content area. But sometimes that's what you want. You want to stop it cold before it loads the main query and brings in all of this other stuff to say, freeze, get something else completely. This is a good place where you might want to choose to redirect someone. Right, you had a contact-us page. Now you have a contact page. Maybe you want to point people somewhere else. Or maybe you've got a short URL that you're using for promotional purposes that expands out to a much longer, verbose URL. You could tap into the request filter and repoint people. In fact, that's how some plugins do it. Like there's a WP redirection plugin that hooks in here and elsewhere for managing redirects inside of WordPress. Most likely, you'd probably want to do this even before you've touched WordPress back at the Apache, in your htaccess file or Nginx config, so that the server doesn't have to boot up all of this other stuff, get WordPress loaded, and then go, oh, we're at the wrong place. Throw that away. Take me somewhere else. But you can do it here. But you can also do this to set other variables to modify the main query. There's also parse query, which is much better at handling the different query variables that you might want to pass down through to adjust what posts are being shown. This is an action hook, so you're not actually modifying some of the stuff directly, but you can modify it indirectly, if that makes sense. So this fires after all of the other query vars have been set, so that we know. Are we looking at posts? Are we looking at pages? Do we want 10 posts per page or 12 posts per page? And it also fires after all of the conditionals are set. So we can know if we're on an archive or a single page or post or what have you. And this runs on every single query, including the admin area. So when you start modifying things, you'll want to be sure to specify if not is admin, then go ahead and change things. Otherwise, you change the query for just showing posts in the admin area, which may not be desirable. Or it may be, depends on what you're trying to do. Pre-get post is my favorite. So this is another action hook. And it fires before the query is run, but only just before. So WordPress has gotten all the different query vars that it needs for hitting the database. It's put it all together for you and says, this is what I think we're going to query. And so this is basically your last possible moment to stop it and say, like, no, no, no. I know you think you want 12 posts. I only actually want 1. So let's change posts per page to 1 for this query, and we'll just show the first result. Or you thought you wanted posts. I'm here to tell you that you actually want posts and products, or posts and podcasts, right? To bring in other kinds of content into the main loop, for instance. And this is run on every query. So you need to be careful here to say, I only want to modify the main query, or I want to modify everything except the main query. And so WordPress has a conditional for this called isMainQuery. So you can say, if isMainQuery, return. Don't do anything else. Or if not isMainQuery, return. So that way you can modify only the main query or only everything else. Conditionals do work, but not the bare conditionals like isArchive. You have to say the query method. So WP query arrow isArchive. Because the wrapper functions don't get populated until we're into the template. And here we're still way before a template gets loaded. And then, if you're feeling mighty adventurous or you're trying to do something super complicated and you can't just get there by writing an array statement of like, here's what the data that I want, or instead of 12 posts, I want 15. It even gives you, what do we got, 10 different filters for modifying the raw SQL that WordPress uses. I've had to use some of these just a handful of times. I don't expect you to memorize them now. I do expect you to search the codex or Google when you're like, how do I modify the where clause in SQL before WordPress actually runs things? Turns out there's a posts where clause where you can alter the where clause in SQL before it actually runs the final query to the database. So the pre-get posts is the last stop for you if you want to modify sort of the array of query args that WordPress is using. And then all of these SQL filters are the next step. So WordPress has started to turn things into SQL, but you want to change what that SQL is because you've got something that's like a very specific kind of query to run that WP query doesn't yet understand for some reason. And I found in my own use case, my need to use these has gotten rarer and rarer because of things like meta-query and tax query getting more advanced. And just because of my own abilities with MySQL getting better, I'll just bypass WP query entirely and write a simple MySQL statement and run that through the WPDB class, which is a different talk that we could spend hours on. So there are a bunch of mistakes that you can make when you are trying to modify queries or run new queries that can cost you a lot of performance on your server, perhaps crash the server if you get too many visitors. So let's not make those. The first gotcha here is query posts. This is less dire to note in 2017, but query posts was the go-to instruction for many, many, many tutorial sites for many, many, many years. And it's bad for a lot of reasons. It will forever be in core because WordPress is very good about backwards compatibility, and they don't want to break what you're doing, even when what you're doing is very harmful to the overall operation of your site. But don't use query posts is the takeaway here. And the reason it's bad, in case you were wondering, is it stomps all over the global space in PHP. So it overrides the main WP query global object and a whole bunch of other ones. And so if you run query posts to get something else, and then you're doing that in the middle of the page, WordPress doesn't necessarily know what to show in the footer or in the sidebar because you've changed the context of where you are. So you were on post archive, and you run an extra query to get some author's posts. Now it thinks you're in an author archive as it continues to load the rest of the template, and things just get weird. So don't use query posts. And while we're talking about things to not do, don't set posts per page to -1. This is a really easy hack to say, like, just give me everything. I don't know how many posts there are, but I know I want all of them. So give me all of them. If you have 100,000 posts in that site, this is a bad idea because that site will crash and it'll just be gone. Or you'll have a very, very expensive hosting bill. You might think, like, well, we only have 30 posts. This isn't a big deal. Yeah, until something else goes wrong and you use something that decides to use the posts table as a place to log events. And now you have 100,000 events that were logged. Like Stream WP is a really cool plugin for logging everything that happens in the admin area. By the user who did it, what page they were on, what they were interacting with, when they did it. You can filter it. It's really cool. Uses its own tables, thankfully. But in this example, pretend that it's writing all of these log events to the posts table. It won't take long for it logging every single click and every single admin page view, even for just like 2 users in a site, to amass a fairly sizable log. And if something else modified your query to say, like, yeah, give me all of those too, and you said, well, just give me everything I've got, now you're trying to query 100,000 things on the front end of the website and you crash it. So instead, pick a sane large default, right? If you're only going to show like 100, or you're like, there'll never be more than 50 of these things, well, double it and say, like, well, there'll probably never be more than 100. And just set post per page to 100. Because if there are more than 100 of something, you probably don't want all of them at once anyway, even if you think you want all of them. So just pick a nice positive integer that's bigger than what you think you'll ever need, but not like 1,000,000, right? And then the last 2 are sort of related to query posts. Anytime you create a new WP query object, doesn't matter what variable you assign it to, you do mess with some of the things in the global scope of WordPress. And so a very good idea is to call WP reset post data if you've altered the post function at all, because that resets us the global post variable back to whatever it should have been originally. And then WP reset query resets everything back to whatever the main query was when the page was first loaded. This helps later in the template. So let's say you've altered something in the main loop, and then WordPress continues to load the sidebar and the footer. It will continue to know what page you were on in the first place because you've reset things back to that at the end, like a good citizen. And I know that one of these automatically calls the other. I think WP reset query automatically calls WP reset post data. So you don't necessarily need to use both of them when you've modified both things. I just got in the habit of always doing both. It doesn't really matter. There's no performance hit for using one or both. And now let's talk about how we can optimize things to make things better. So we already talked about how running one query is actually running 4 queries, and how if you try to run a second query in your template, now you've got 8, right? Because you've got the first 4 that WordPress ran, plus the 4 that you told it to run, plus all of the other ones that get run for the widgets and everything else on the page. So the first one I already told you, right? Don't use -1 for post per page. Use 100 or 1,000 or whatever, a bigger number than you think you need. You can set no found rows to true, and WordPress won't try to calculate all of the found rows so it can know all of the possible pages that are available. Right? If you just want, I want 100 posts or fewer, I don't care how many others exist, you say no found rows, true, and it won't tell you how many found rows exist. If all you need is a series of post IDs that you're using for something else, you can tell WP Query, listen, all I want are the IDs. I don't need the title, the author, meta, nothing. Just give me the IDs, because I'm going to take the IDs from this query and feed them to another one where I say, give me the posts in this set of IDs. Like maybe you've written a plugin, you want to cache whatever selection someone made. And so you're just caching the IDs to use to repopulate a query on the front end. So you're not caching all of this extra data back in the database, which isn't really caching because you're still requiring people to go back to the database. You can tell it, yes, I do want you to cache these results because I probably am going to use them at some point in the future. And if you are using any kind of caching whatsoever, all of them look for this and go like, aha, this is a query that I do need to care about and save, so I'm going to save it. But then you can also tell it not to cache the post meta or post terms, which is it collecting every single piece of post meta for every single post in the results and every single term for every single set of posts in the results. Because if you don't need the terms or you don't need any meta, you don't want WordPress to query those. So just set those both defaults. WordPress won't bother looking for any post meta or any taxonomies. And now you've just cut out 2 queries. If you set no found rows to true, you've cut out 3 queries. So now you're only querying for the posts themselves. Sometimes that's what you want. Sometimes it's a very good thing to have all of these things that it's collecting because you need them. So you'll have to think through the context of what you're doing to know, should I also get all of the post meta or shouldn't I? And if this wasn't enough, and I know that it's not because I've looked at the WP query class, and it is thousands of lines long. It is a monster, and there are hundreds of filters that you can use, or at least there's more than 100 different filters you can use, depending on what you're trying to change and at what point. I've collected a bunch of other resources to help move you along. The first I want to talk about isn't actually more on WP Query itself, but more on a plugin called Query Monitor, which is one of my favorite plugins, not just for monitoring queries, which is why it has its namesake, but figuring out all kinds of other data about the page that you've learned. So this is a plugin made by a guy named John Blackburn, and it will, at its core, tell you here are all of the queries that were run on this page load, what caused them to be run, how long each of them took to run, so you can find out like which one of these is really slow and making my entire site slow. But it also figures out the template hierarchy. So it'll tell you like, this is the hierarchy path that WordPress used to load the template that you're looking at. These were the ones that were set as true, so it knew to load this template file. But not only did we load the archive.php template file, we also loaded header.php, archive-loop.php, sidebar.php. It tells you every single template partial that was loaded for the page that you're looking at, which I refer to almost constantly when I'm working on a site. And I'm like, how did we get this content? Or why are we not seeing this content? What file am I even looking at? It tells you. And it tells you a whole bunch of other data. It's really cool. It's totally free. You can get it from WordPress.org. Just search for Query Monitor. But then I asked John Blackburn to come on WP Sessions and talk about all of the other cool things that it did. And so he made the 60-minute presentation that dives into like all of these great ways that you can use it to make your site a bit faster or to figure out really weird things that are going on just by mining the data that this plugin gives you, which is awesome. Then we've got 2 other talks that helped inspire this one. The first one is from 2011 from Andrew Nason called You Don't Know Query, where he talks about a whole bunch of things which are going to be somewhat redundant to what I shared today. And then Drew Janes gave one in 2015 at Cape Town called Getting Creative with WordPress Queries, where he shares a bunch of different examples of like, maybe you want this kind of data. So here's a weird query you're going to have to run to get it. And so he's got a lot of good stuff there. Both of these are on WordPress.tv, and then we've got links to their slides, which you can also get straight from WordPress TV. And then all of the other resources that I've referenced throughout the slides, plus a fascinating article by Scott Taylor. His handle is Wonderboy Music. He's one of the people we get to thank for things like date query coming into existence, because he was one of the authors of it. And he needed it for working in his day job at the New York Times so they could create all of these really elaborate date-based queries. I forget, I think they had a section called First Edition or First Draft maybe, so they needed every post that had been published in the last 24 hours. Here it is. But not just that, we need that for all of these other different conditions. And so he walks through like, here's what we needed to get, here's how I figured out how to do it, and this was the query that I wrote. So a very insightful article. I tried to get him to give a presentation and expand on that, but he is super busy and popular, so that hasn't happened yet. And then as I mentioned at the beginning, I run WP Sessions, where I have 80 plus hours of training from all these other smart people, and I sell a membership there if you want it. No hard pressure if you don't, but you can get $100 off if you use the coupon that's available at the same WC ORL page where all of these slides and resources are. And if you are admiring my shirt, I am making a second batch. You can buy one of those there as well. And if you don't, fine. That's up to you. And again, all of the slides and resources are at wpsessions.com/WCURL. All of these, all of the links, everything. And I think we still have about 10 minutes for questions, if anybody has any. So fire away. Don't be shy. There are no bad questions. Even if you're like, everybody else knows this. Yes?
Is there any kind of general rule or guideline for how many queries could or should run on?
The general rule for, the question is there a general rule for how many queries you can or should run on a page? Fewer than what you're running is the general rule. Like if you can find a way to cut out queries, you should cut them out. The fewer, the better. But there's no like magic number like if you have 10, that's awesome. If you have 50, that's terrible because every query can be different. You can have one that's just like a beast that is hitting like 10 different tables and joining all this data together and it's super complicated and it takes a minute to run. And you could have all these other ones that take like a fraction of a second to run. One of the things I like about Query Monitor is it gives you a breakdown of how long the page took to load. And specifically, here's how much of that was spent like on I/O back and forth, getting data to and from the server. Here's how much was spent on queries. Here's how much was spent on PHP rendering all of the data. And generally, all of the queries that run should run in milliseconds. So if you got 50 and they take 500 milliseconds, that's OK, right? So yeah, there's no hard and fast rule except fewer. Cool. Other questions? You in the front, sir.
Yes. How can you explain what, because WordPress does caching on its own, but how WP Query interacts with perhaps server-side caching or, well, just any caching you can think of off the top?
Yeah, so the question is how does WP Query interact with caching? Because we talked about a few different things that it tries to cache, right? And so WordPress at its core has a few different caches that it sets up that aren't true caching in that it's available for a later use by default. It's just we've got this data already accessible. We don't have to go back to the server within the context of this one page load. So it's caching in that aspect where we don't have to go back to the database, but it's not a persistent cache. So if you refresh the page, it has to go back to the database to get all of that data again. And so there are lots of drop-in solutions that you can use to cache data. Plugins like W3 Total Cache, which most of the caching plugins, to be honest, are a series of tire fires for one reason or another. And it's not because the people who made them are not good developers or that they're not written well. It's that everybody has slightly different needs because WordPress is so versatile that they have to expose so many of the decisions back to you, the user, and you just have a litany of checkboxes like, well, yes, this one, and maybe this one. And sometimes, because you're probably not a caching expert, you'll cache two things that don't cooperate together, and now things are worse than if you had never used the plugin in the first place. The good news is most managed hosts now have their own bundled caching solution that they provide to you, right? WP Engine, SiteGround, Bluehost, like all of them have something because they control the hardware as well as access to it. So they can say, all right, install our caching plugin, turn it on, we take care of everything else. So if your host offers caching, I suggest using that first. If they don't, I suggest looking at things like WP Rocket, which is a caching plugin that's not plagued by things like W3 Total Cache and Super Cacher and the caching plugins of old, because they got smart and like, people don't know what this is. We're just going to optimize for the best possible path for the most number of users, and that's what they get. And what that gives you is persistent caching across page loads. And so it writes whatever you're getting from the database to memory. So it's stored in RAM, essentially, for every subsequent visit. Sometimes it gets stored to the hard drive. Where it gets stored is largely irrelevant to us. But then it can capture the full results of WP Query. It can cache other random things that you want to use, because WordPress has a whole bunch of caching functions built in that by default don't actually do anything. But you can say set cache and get cache. And then if you choose to have a caching thing in there, those use that, put the stuff in memory, get it back out again, and so on and so forth. And so if we back up a few slides, there are, oops, that's forward. Go way back to here. So cache results true. If you're running a vanilla install of WordPress with no caching solution at all, does nothing. You can say, I want you to cache this. And WordPress will go, OK, someday I will, maybe, but not today. Then you install a caching plugin. Now this query gets cached. And so it has to run once, and then only again after the cache gets flushed. And it has a whole bunch of other things built in behind the scenes that read from that value for intelligently handling whether or not it should save the results or not. Because some things you could save it indefinitely. Some things you only want to save it for an hour. Sometimes you want to save it until a new post is published. And that's why I like a lot of the host-based caching solutions, because they are smart enough to listen for like post-published events and flush the appropriate cache and then rebuild it right away for you so that things get saved. Cool.
A little bit more on the caching. In that example that you talked about real early on, when you think you have 2 queries and you really have 8.
Yeah.
If you're doing a new query and you don't set update post meta cache to false, you're saying that it's going to do a second query after it gets your results, pull in all that, and then afterwards, if you do a get post meta, it's not actually going to the database at that point. It's pulling from its own cache.
Yep.
So what happens if you run a new query and you set that to false, and then you actually try to attempt to get meta?
That's a good one. So the question, distilled back down, is if you have it fetch all of the post meta during your query, then get post meta never has to hit the database. What happens if you set that to false, so it's not getting all of the meta, but you do call get post meta? What does WordPress do then? Then it just goes back round trip to the database again to get whatever you're after. So the first thing it checks is, do we already have this in the global WP query object? No? OK, go to the database and get this thing exactly. So things will still work, they just won't be as performant. And something like something like Query Monitor can help you find things like that, because you'll find a page where like, we have 150 queries. What's going on here? Get post meta, get post meta, get, oh, we didn't. We're looking for all of this post meta, but we didn't actually tell the main query to get it. There you go. Sweet. Any other questions?
How many posts and post meta relations can you have before WordPress starts to really slow down? If you have 100,000 posts of a certain post type, and each of those post types have like 20 custom fields that's stored in the meta table, obviously that's going to be a lot of metadata.
Yeah.
At what point would you recommend transitioning to like a custom table implementation over just using the post table and post meta?
I like your question a lot. The question is, how much data can you throw at WordPress before it starts to struggle? Like how many posts, how much post meta before it slows down and has all these weird performance problems? And additionally, when do you decide I need to put this in a custom database table to reduce the kind of queries that I'm getting versus just using the tables that WordPress gives me? That is the exact question that caused me to launch WP Sessions. Because it's like, how did I make it this far into my career and not know enough about databases to know, like, should I put this in a custom table or shouldn't I? And I'm finally going to have someone come on the site to talk about that, probably in January. But the short answer is WordPress can take a lot of data, a lot. I worked with some high-end WooCommerce sites that were they were doing something in the ballpark of 2,000 add to cart requests per minute during like their Black Friday sales. Just a lot of volume, which generated a lot of orders. And for every order you make in WooCommerce, you have a post or two that gets created, and then like 60 meta records that get put into post meta, and comments and comment meta. Like the data just goes all over the place for WooCommerce at the moment, and they're working to change that in the upcoming releases, which is good. They've realized at this point they need to have a custom table, because every order generating 60 pieces of meta and user meta and comments and comment meta and all of this other jazz is just too much to try and query back out in an efficient manner. The limiting factor is your host. How powerful your server is and all of that determines how much data you can have. The shorter answer is a lot. And if you notice that things are getting pinched and slowing down, you probably just need to move to a slightly bigger box. And most hosts can grow with you for that. Some can't, and then you have to find a different host. And usually the solution is we separate the database from everything else, so you're querying this one machine that's specifically built for that. And that's when you're getting into multiple hundreds of thousands of records, usually. And then in terms of knowing when you need to make a custom table versus store things in the normal tables, you should try to think through that before you make a thing. Like before you make your custom plugin and say, like, I think I'm going to make posts, and then I'm going to put all of this in post meta. Think about all of the different ways you need to get that data. This is how I got backed into a corner, and like, how did I not know this stuff? I'm an idiot. Because I was working on an award system for WordPress, and then we wanted to create leaderboards and figure out like who's gotten the most points, or how many times has this particular badge been earned, and who earned it most recently, or the most number of times. And all of the earning data was stored in user meta, and it was stored as a single array, because I didn't want to pollute the user meta. So we just took every time they earned something and just stuffed it in that array. So you've earned 50 badges. These are the ones you've earned and when you earn them, which is fine when we're just looking at your data and your earnings. But when we want to have a global leaderboard to query all of that user meta and then parse all of that user meta in PHP, because we can't just get it back out via MySQL, it was a nightmare. And then I realized, like, maybe I should have made a custom table that was called earnings, and we just had a bunch of columns, right? Here's the ID of what the badge was, and the user ID of who earned it, and how many points they earned when they got it, and the time, and all of the stuff. And then we could just query that table in one simple MySQL statement, instead of this Frankenstein monster of like, well, I need to query the posts, and we have to have an inner join to get the post meta, and another inner join for another piece of meta, and another one, and we got to query the users, and we have to join them here. And that query ends up taking like 5 minutes to run for 400 records, and that is just a bad time for everybody. So when you run into that, the solution is to put it in a custom table. Hopefully you figure that out ahead of time. And just the exercise that I found helpful is thinking not what data do I need to store, but what data do I need to display, and how much of it, and in what contexts. And generally speaking, posts and post meta is a good place to stuff things because WordPress has it all figured out. But sometimes when you're doing things like a leaderboard or a very specific kind of data, like e-commerce data, it's better to put it in a custom table where you can control, here are all of the different pieces of information that I need for every record that I pull out of this.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Does WordPress have its own custom wrappers for doing your own custom SQL queries?
Yes, that's a great question. WordPress does have its own custom wrappers for creating SQL queries. There's a global class called WPDB that has a whole bunch of methods available to it by default, which are themselves mostly just wrappers for different kinds of queries, insert, delete, whatever. And then it has its own properties for accessing the tables that it knows about, because WordPress can have a different prefix for all the tables for every install, right? So it has a variable for knowing what is the prefix, and then it has variables for knowing, like, okay, what's the name of the posts table, or what's the name of the post meta table. So you don't actually have to know what it is, because WordPress will tell you. So you can register your own properties for your own tables and teach WPDB how to talk to it, so that you can sort of speed things along. You can kind of do that with WP Query too, like all of those SQL filters are ways of helping you teach WP Query how to speak a different table's language. And then, shoot, there was one other thing for making that. Oh, meta. All of the meta functions for get meta, update meta, and stuff. Those are like get post meta is a wrapper for get metadata. So if you wanted to create your own custom meta table for something that's structured in the same way, you can now have your own like get recipe meta function that uses all of the core internals, but is otherwise still its own custom thing. Sweet. I think we have time for -2 questions. So if you have more questions, look for me. This is what I look like. Here's my face. This is the shirt I'm wearing. I'll be out there around. Just find me and stop me, because I'm here to answer any questions you have. Otherwise, thank you so much.